I met Clarissa at an art auction in Santa Barbara on a June evening sweetened by sea air and orchestral strings. She was poised at the edge of the Rothko exhibit in a crimson dress that matched neither the occasion nor the art, and that's what caught my eye. She didn't blend in. She didn't want to. Before I proceed, if you're drawn to dark, elegant tales of betrayal and quiet revenge, subscribe now. Our conversation began over brushstrokes and Cabernet, and by the time the moon crowned over the bluff, we were laughing like co-conspirators. Within 6 months, we were married. I was 54, she 37. I wasn't naive. I knew the difference in age meant I'd be giving more than I received, but I was prepared for that. Or thought I was. She came with a daughter, Lily, 13 years old, thin as a blade, with a quiet cunning that adults often mistake for shyness. Her father, I was told, had been a ghost, vanished after a messy addiction spiral. I didn't question it. I saw Lily as a fragile extension of Clarissa, someone I could protect and perhaps mold into a woman with a future untainted by the chaos she was born into. Over the years, I did what I thought was right. Private tutors, fencing lessons, European summers, a horse named Clementine. I never tried to replace her father, but I gave her the stability I assumed she needed. I even paid for her therapy, never asking what wounds she nursed there. If there were ever cracks in her behavior, cruelty to staff, a smirk when others failed, I chalked it up to youth. Mistakes to be corrected, not portents of betrayal. Our home was a glass and steel modernist masterpiece in Brentwood, art on the walls, silence in the halls. Clarissa returned to managing her gallery, and I returned to running my capital management firm. On paper, we were the portrait of curated elegance. But like all expensive portraits, it was an illusion held together by lighting and distance. Still, I believed in my role, the provider, the steadying hand. I never thought that love had to be loud. I thought being useful was enough. It began with a suitcase. I had just returned from Zurich. 3 days, 12 meetings, 1 merger. My driver dropped me at the Brentwood gate, and the silence inside the house felt unusually taut. No music, no scent of Clarissa's sandalwood candles. Just the sound of my own footsteps on polished travertine. I remember setting down my suitcase by the hall mirror and catching my own reflection. Tired, older than I liked to admit, but not yet ready for war. Clarissa was waiting in the sitting room. She wore black, which struck me as theatrical for midday. Her hands trembled, and when she opened her mouth, her voice was trembling too. I thought someone had died. "It's about Lily," she said. I lowered myself into the leather chair, bracing. "She's told me something. Something terrible. From years ago." And then she said the words, calmly rehearsed, drawn from a script I would later discover on a hard drive. "She says you touched her when she was 17. There was a pause after that, intentional, practiced. She waited for me to crumble, to confess, to do anything but what I actually did. Stare at her with a kind of slow-burning clarity. Not shock, not rage. Just a chilling understanding that something irreversible had just been set in motion. I didn't say a word. Within the hour, 2 officers were on the property. I wasn't arrested. There were no charges yet, but the implication hung in the air like formaldehyde. Clarissa gave them a statement. Lily, I was told, would be giving hers to a detective the following day. No one asked me for my version of events. I was advised by my attorney to remain silent. The fallout was swift. My firm placed me on leave, indefinitely, they said, though I could hear the finality behind the euphemism. Several clients began requesting account transfers. A tabloid picked up the whispers by day 4. The title read, "Respected Financier Under Suspicion in Family Scandal." I hadn't even been charged. But Clarissa wasn't done. She filed for divorce that Friday, citing emotional instability and the protection of her daughter. My assets, joint and personal, were temporarily frozen due to the protective order she requested. She used the accusation like a key, unlocking vaults she'd never had access to before. That weekend, I sat alone in a hotel suite overlooking the Pacific. The waves crashed in rhythmic indifference below, while inside me, something quieter stirred, a calculation. Grief would come later. Anger would be shaped into something more elegant. But in that moment, I opened the vault of my own memory. Not to relive what had happened, but to recall what had not. I had never touched Lily, never looked at her inappropriately. I had raised her, clothed her, educated her, financed her every whim. And in return, I had been cast as a monster for profit. But they had overlooked one thing. Clarissa had never read the prenup. Not really. She had signed it in a rush of champagne and diamonds, eager to marry wealth and escape obscurity. She had never noticed Section 5, Clause 12, buried deep in the legalese, a safeguard suggested by Simone Patel, my ruthless but discreet attorney. The clause stated clearly, any public accusation made by the spouse or her dependents against the undersigned, if proven false by a preponderance of digital or testimonial evidence, would void all claims to marital property, including, but not limited to, spousal support, shared assets, and business holdings. A fiction, once exposed, would cost her everything. And so I waited, not in panic, not in fear, in strategy. I moved into a discreet condo in Century City, 3 bedrooms, all beige and chrome, the kind of place designed to be lived in by no one for very long. It served my purpose. I needed quiet, seclusion, and most of all, plausible invisibility. Clarissa believed she had me cornered, that I was too humiliated, too paralyzed by shame to strike back. That miscalculation would become her undoing. First, I called Simone. She had drafted my prenuptial agreement with surgical precision 7 years ago and had been waiting for the day someone tried to test its limits. I'm sending you a secure drive, she said without hesitation. Start collecting everything: calls, texts, cloud backups. Don't ask questions. Don't speak to the press. And above all, don't let them know you're awake yet. It began with Lily's iCloud. Because I had purchased the MacBook for her university studies under my corporate account, I had retained administrative access. She never changed the recovery email. Within 48 hours, Simone's forensics team had full visibility into her recent activity. We found 6 versions of the same Word document, her drafted confession. Not a diary entry. Not trauma bleeding onto a page. A script. Each revision was more refined than the last. She changed phrasing, added emotional beats. Tremble, tears, couldn't tell anyone. She practiced wording that would evoke maximum sympathy without legal cross-examination. Even more damning were the Google searches leading up to it. How to phrase a false memory, statute of limitations California, and, chillingly, how to ruin a man's life without evidence. Clarissa's fingerprints were everywhere too. Shared folders. Text messages between them in which she coached Lily through timelines and language. One message read, "Make sure to pause before saying I couldn't breathe." That's what gets them. I never needed to access Lily's therapist records, though we could have. The digital trail alone was enough to unmake their story. By the end of the second week, we had a dossier Simone described as courtroom napalm. But I didn't want the courtroom. Not yet. Legal vindication might have cleared my name on paper, but it wouldn't remove the stain from Google, from whispers, from the collective memory of a community trained to believe accusations first, questions later. What I needed was private retribution. Financial, social, psychological. So thorough it would leave them not just exposed, but undone. Simone began with a sealed defamation suit. Not for show, but leverage. The kind of suit that's never public, but holds weight in backrooms. We submitted it to Clarissa's attorney, one of those overconfident Bel Air litigators more skilled at divorce theater than contract nuance. He didn't see the clause coming. He assumed we'd settle. Instead, Simone dropped the full discovery report in his lap. They tried to retract. Lily issued a statement that she may have misremembered events under duress. Clarissa followed with her own damage control, citing emotional stress and a family misunderstanding. But the clause didn't require conviction, only proof of falsehood. The moment their narrative fractured under documentation, the trigger activated. Clarissa's divorce petition imploded. All claims to spousal support, null. Asset contention, forfeited. Even her name was quietly removed from property deeds she'd once flaunted on social media. but we were just warming up. You see, I had always made it easy for her. An unlimited Amex. A staff that never questioned her whims. A gallery I once saved from insolvency by connecting her to my network of bored tech millionaires and real estate heiresses. And now, it was time to undo every favor I had ever extended. Not loudly, but thoroughly. Revenge is most potent when mistaken for silence. While Clarissa spun feeble retractions and Lily retreated from public view, I began dismantling the life I had once gifted them, thread by thread, quietly, legally, and with a surgeon's hand. It started with the gallery. Clarissa's precious little kingdom on Melrose Avenue, funded by my seed capital and propped up by my clients, many of whom she never knew were mine. Using a shell company managed by a former business rival turned ally, I purchased the lease beneath her gallery in a quiet bidding war. The landlord, tempted by a 35% premium and a 10-year contract, didn't hesitate. Within 60 days, she received a termination notice citing intent to redevelop. She called me in a panic. Not to beg, of course, but to discuss options. I didn't answer. Simone, ever thorough, ensured that whispers of forged provenance, entirely fabricated but never disproven, began circulating among Clarissa's artist network. A well-placed rumor to a critic here, a speculative blog post there. It was enough to cause two of her most bankable artists to pull out of representation. When you deal in aesthetics, reputation is capital. By the time the gallery shuttered, she owed more than it was worth. Lily, meanwhile, had her eyes on graduate school. Yale, Columbia, Oxford. I still had friends on every admissions board worth knowing, many of whom had benefited from my firm's endowments or quiet philanthropic gifts. I didn't ask them to reject her, only to read her name. And perhaps recall the phrase, how to ruin a man's life without evidence. She was blackballed without ever knowing why. I also had her trust fund frozen. Not seized, just audited indefinitely under suspicion of misuse. Funds I had intended for her law school dreams now sat locked behind walls of compliance paperwork she couldn't understand, monitored by an independent fiduciary I appointed. Let her learn bureaucracy. But perhaps the most satisfying stroke was the property. Clarissa and Lily had stayed in the Brentwood house under temporary court permission. The moment the falsehood was confirmed, Simone filed a motion to revoke occupancy under the protective clause in our prenuptial agreement. The judge, who had initially eyed me with disdain, now wore an expression I can only describe as amused resignation. The order was granted. I gave them 30 days. When they refused to vacate, I didn't send a sheriff. I sent a moving company, quiet professionals in black uniforms who emptied the home in 6 hours. Art, furniture, even the fret linens. Everything was legally mine. I had receipts for it all. Clarissa returned from a weekend in Palm Springs to find the house bare, save for Lily's old fencing trophies and a mirror. Let them reflect. After that, they vanished from the social radar. Clarissa attempted a return to the art scene with an online boutique. It failed within 3 months. Lily took a job at a nonprofit, one of those ambiguous titles that paid in purpose, not prestige. Their former friends, those gallery wives and yoga benefactors, stopped inviting them. Not because I told them to, but because wealth recognizes weakness, and betrayal, once uncovered, contaminates all associations. In one final, quiet move, I made a large, anonymous donation to a fund supporting victims of false allegations, real ones, the kind that destroy lives in silence. It was poetic, and it was just. By the end of the year, I stood in the penthouse office I had once considered selling, staring out at the skyline I had rebuilt myself. I had survived the fire. And I had learned that destruction is not always a loud thing. Sometimes, it's a whisper in a boardroom. A clause buried in a contract. A silence that returns to you, not as defeat, but as power. 16 months after the accusation that nearly dismantled my life, I found myself seated across from a judge, not in a courtroom, but in a private arbitration chamber, the kind reserved for people whose wealth deserves quiet. The case file bore an unceremonious title, James R. Hale versus Clarissa M. Hale and Lily T. Chambers. A line that looked clinical in black ink, but held every betrayal, every sleepless night, and every calculated strike I had endured and executed. The judge, a former federal appellate justice turned high-salaried arbiter, flipped through the documentation slowly. Simone sat beside me in a slate-gray suit, her expression unreadable. Clarissa and Lily were across from us, visibly aged. Clarissa's cheekbones, once her weapon of choice, looked sharp with stress. Lily, who had perfected the art of affectation, kept her gaze lowered, a performance she no longer knew how to abandon. They were here to negotiate a ceasefire, but I had already won the war. "I'd like to propose a statement," Clarissa's lawyer said, meek now, humbled by the quiet devastation I had unleashed. "A private retraction, mutual non-disparagement, and full withdrawal of all remaining claims." I said nothing. Let silence weigh on them like gravity. The judge looked at me. "Mr. Hale?" I leaned forward slowly, folding my hands. "No retraction. No agreement. I want the record to remain as it is. I want the accusation to stand, next to the proof that it was false. That is justice. Let them explain it forever." Clarissa's jaw tightened. Lily blinked rapidly, as if tears might buy back a currency already spent. I stood. "This is not vengeance," I said, looking only at the judge. "This is documentation." Then I left. Outside the chamber, the air felt unnaturally clean. The city hummed beneath me, indifferent, busy, alive. I walked 3 blocks before calling a car. In that time, I thought about the man I had been before Clarissa. Earnest, purposeful, oblivious to the type of people who weaponize fragility and confusion for gain. And I thought about the man I had become. I wasn't unkind. I wasn't cruel. But I was awake now. I knew where to hide sharp edges, in contracts, in whispers, in silence. Power, I had learned, wasn't in presence. It was in what you withhold. Weeks later, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside, a note in Lily's handwriting. I believed I could rewrite the truth, but it rewrote me. "I hope one day you can forget." I never will. I burned the note without reply. In the years that followed, I continued to build, though more quietly. I traveled more. I sold the Brentwood house and never bought another. I kept the art, but not the memories. And once a year, on the date of the accusation, I donated to a foundation helping those falsely accused, anonymously, always. Revenge was never about destruction. It was about design. Let Clarissa and Lily live. Let them explain, wherever they go, what happened, why their lifestyle dissolved, why they live in anonymity when once they lived in light. Let them tell the story again and again, while I, the monster they created, remain silent and free. If you found power in the quiet triumph of this story, subscribe now for more first-person tales of betrayal, reinvention, and elegant revenge. Because sometimes the loudest justice is the one never spoken aloud.